Can I sit with you, Daddy? The small voice pierced through the elegant atmosphere of Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, as 6-year-old Marcus Williams pressed his face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring with wide eyes at the man in the expensive suit who was dining alone at a corner table. The child's clothes were dirty and torn, his sneakers held together with duct tape, and his stomach growled audibly as he watched Khalil al-Rashid cut into a perfectly prepared piece of salmon that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. What neither of them knew was that this moment of innocent hunger meeting immense wealth would trigger a chain of events that would transform both their lives in ways that neither could have imagined, revealing truths about family, loss, and the power of unexpected connections that transcend every boundary of race, class, and circumstance. Khalil had come to Le Bernardin seeking solitude and the familiar comfort of exceptional food, but he was actually running from a grief so profound that no amount of wealth or luxury could ease its weight. 3 months earlier, his own 6-year-old son Amir had died in a car accident in Dubai, a tragedy that had shattered Khalil's marriage, destroyed his relationship with his extended family, and left him wandering through life like a ghost haunting his own existence. The real estate empire he had built over 2 decades suddenly felt meaningless. The penthouse apartment felt like a mausoleum, and every interaction with other people reminded him of the laughter and joy that had been stolen from his life forever. Marcus had been living on the streets of Manhattan for 2 weeks, ever since his grandmother had died and the foster care system had failed to place him in a stable home. At 6 years old, he possessed an intelligence and resilience that had allowed him to survive by finding scraps of food, sleeping in doorways, and avoiding the attention of authorities who might send him back to the group home where older children had stolen his belongings and made his life miserable. But hunger was becoming a constant companion, and the sight of the man eating alone had triggered memories of sitting with his grandmother at their small kitchen table, sharing whatever meal she had managed to prepare from their meager resources. The restaurant's maitre d' noticed the child immediately and moved swiftly to address what he saw as a disruption to the establishment's carefully maintained atmosphere of refined elegance. "Excuse me, young man, but you can't be here," he said firmly, approaching Marcus with the kind of authority that was designed to remove problems quickly and quietly. "This is a private restaurant, and unaccompanied children are not permitted on the premises." But Marcus was too hungry and too desperate to be intimidated by adult authority, and his eyes remained fixed on Khalil through the window. "Please, sir, I just want to eat something," he said, his voice carrying the kind of innocent honesty that cuts through pretense and social barriers like a knife. "That man looks like he has lots of food, and my grandma always said that sharing food was how people showed love to each other." The mention of his grandmother's wisdom about food and love hit Marcus with a wave of sadness, because she had been the only person who had ever truly cared for him, and her death had left him completely alone in a world that seemed designed to ignore children like him. But even in his grief and desperation, he retained the fundamental optimism and trust that had allowed him to survive circumstances that would have broken many adults. Khalil heard the commotion outside and looked up from his untouched meal to see the small boy being gently but firmly guided away from the window by restaurant staff. Something about the child's posture, the way he held his thin shoulders, reminded Khalil so powerfully of his own son that he felt as though he had been struck by lightning. The similarity was not physical, because Marcus was African American and Amir had been Arab, but there was something in the boy's eyes, some quality of innocence mixed with determination, that transported Khalil back to memories of his son that he had been trying desperately to suppress. "Wait," Khalil called out, his voice carrying across the dining room with an authority that immediately stopped the maitre d' in his tracks. "Bring the child inside. He can join me for dinner." The request sent a ripple of surprise through the restaurant, because Le Bernardin was not the kind of establishment where homeless children were typically welcomed as dinner guests. The other diners turned to stare at the unusual scene unfolding, some with curiosity, others with obvious disapproval at this breach of the social order that kept poverty safely separated from privilege. The maitre d' approached Khalil's table with the diplomatic skill that his position required, lowering his voice to address what he assumed was a momentary lapse in judgment by one of the restaurant's most valued customers. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I'm not sure that would be appropriate. The child appears to be homeless, and we have policies about unaccompanied minors that are designed to protect both the establishment and our guests. But Khalil was not interested in policies or appropriateness, because seeing Marcus had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Amir's death, a capacity for connection and care that he had thought was buried forever with his son. "The child is hungry, and I'm eating alone," he said simply. "There's no policy against sharing a meal with someone who needs it." The simplicity of Khalil's logic was undeniable, but the maitre d' could see the potential for complications if word spread that Le Bernardin had relaxed its standards to accommodate street children. "Sir, perhaps we could arrange for a meal to be prepared for the child to take with him. That would address his immediate need without creating any awkwardness for other guests." The suggestion of sending Marcus away with a takeout meal revealed everything that was wrong with a system that preferred charitable gestures to human connection, treating poverty as a problem to be managed rather than people to be welcomed. Khalil understood that the maitre d' was trying to preserve the comfortable distance between wealth and need that allowed rich people to feel generous without actually having to interact with the recipients of their charity. "I'm not interested in managing his need from a distance," Khalil replied, his voice taking on an edge that restaurant staff recognized as a warning not to push further. "I'm inviting him to share my table, and I expect that invitation to be honored with the same respect you would show any guest I chose to dine with." The authority in Khalil's voice, combined with his status as one of the restaurant's most important customers, ended the discussion. The maitre d' nodded reluctantly and returned to Marcus, who had been watching the adult conversation with the sharp intelligence that street children develop to assess whether situations are safe or dangerous. "The gentleman would like you to join him for dinner," the maitre d' announced, his professional training overcoming his personal reservations about the unusual arrangement. "Please follow me, and we'll get you seated properly." Marcus's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire restaurant. The pure joy of a hungry child who had been offered not just food, but the dignity of eating at a table like a real person, rather than scrounging for scraps like an animal. He followed the maitre d' across the dining room, his torn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, oblivious to the stares and whispered comments from other diners who were witnessing something that challenged their assumptions about how the world was supposed to work. As Marcus approached the table, Khalil was struck again by the boy's resemblance to his son. Not in appearance, but in the quality of curiosity and resilience that seemed to shine through, despite his obvious hardship. "Hello," Khalil said softly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "My name is Khalil. What's your name?" "I'm Marcus," the boy replied, scrambling onto the chair with the eagerness of someone who hadn't sat at a proper table in weeks. "Thank you for letting me eat with you, Mr. Khalil. My grandma always said that eating alone makes food taste sad, but eating with people makes it taste like love." The wisdom in Marcus's grandmother's saying hit Khalil with unexpected force, because he had been eating alone for months, and the food had indeed tasted like nothing but obligation and routine. But sitting across from this child, seeing the hope and gratitude in his eyes, Khalil felt something stirring that he had thought was dead forever. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a very wise woman," Khalil said, signaling to their server that they would need a second-place setting. "Would you like to tell me about her while we decide what to order?" The invitation to share memories of his grandmother opened floodgates for Marcus, who had been carrying his grief alone with no one to talk to about the woman who had been his entire world. "She took care of me since I was a baby because my mama couldn't," he said, his words tumbling out with the relief of finally having someone who seemed genuinely interested in listening. "She worked cleaning offices at night so she could be with me during the day, and she always made sure I did my homework, even when we didn't have much food." The story of a grandmother sacrificing everything for her grandchild resonated deeply with Khalil, who remembered his own grandmother in Lebanon taking care of him when his parents were building their business empire. The universal nature of grandmotherly love transcended culture and economics, creating a connection between his experience and Marcus's that made their differences in wealth and background seem suddenly irrelevant. "She sounds like she loved you very much," Khalil said, watching as Marcus's eyes filled with tears at the acknowledgement of his loss. "What happened to her?" "She got sick and went to the hospital, but she didn't come back," Marcus replied, his voice becoming smaller as he confronted the reality that still felt impossible to accept. "The social worker said I had to go live with other kids in a group home, but the big boys there were mean and took my stuff, so I ran away. I've been looking for a new family ever since, but nobody wants a kid like me." The casual way that Marcus described his abandonment by the system that was supposed to protect him revealed a level of neglect and institutional failure that Khalil, despite all his wealth and success, felt powerless to address. But in this moment, at this table, he could offer something immediate and meaningful: the simple dignity of being seen, heard, and cared for as a human being deserving of respect and attention. The server approached their table with the professional discretion that Le Bernardin's staff were trained to maintain, but Khalil could see the curiosity in her eyes as she took in the unusual pairing of one of the city's wealthiest real estate developers and a homeless child, sharing what was clearly becoming more than just a meal. "What would you like to eat, Marcus?" Khalil asked, opening the menu and realizing that a 6-year-old might find the sophisticated French cuisine intimidating or unfamiliar. "Have you ever had salmon before?" Marcus studied the menu with intense concentration, though Khalil suspected that the boy's reading skills might not be sufficient to navigate the complex descriptions and foreign terminology. "I can't read all the words," Marcus admitted without shame, displaying the kind of honesty that comes from having no energy left for pretense or embarrassment. "But I like fish, and I like anything that comes with vegetables, because my grandma said vegetables make you strong." The practical wisdom that Marcus had absorbed from his grandmother, combined with his willingness to admit what he didn't know without feeling diminished, impressed Khalil in ways that reminded him of his own son's intellectual curiosity and emotional intelligence. "Then let's start with some salmon and vegetables, and we can add other things if you're still hungry," he suggested. As they waited for their food to arrive, Khalil found himself asking questions that he hadn't realized he wanted to know the answers to, drawn into Marcus's world by a combination of genuine curiosity and the desperate need to connect with someone who reminded him of what he had lost. "Where have you been sleeping since you left the group home?" "Different places," Marcus replied with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to describe situations that would horrify adults. "Sometimes in doorways, sometimes in the park, when it's warm. I found a cardboard box behind a grocery store that keeps the rain off, and the man who works there gives me old fruit sometimes when nobody's looking." The image of a 6-year-old child creating shelter from cardboard and surviving on discarded fruit while living within blocks of some of the world's most expensive real estate created a cognitive dissonance that Khalil struggled to process. The proximity of extreme wealth to extreme poverty in Manhattan was something he had always known intellectually, but Marcus's presence at his table made it personal in a way that demanded more than intellectual acknowledgement. "Aren't you scared living on the street?" Khalil asked, though he suspected that fear was probably a luxury that Marcus couldn't afford when survival required all his energy and attention. "Sometimes," Marcus admitted, but his tone suggested that fear was just another challenge to be managed, rather than a reason to give up. "But my grandma taught me that being scared is okay, as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what you need to do. She said brave people aren't the ones who don't get scared, they're the ones who get scared and keep going anyway." The sophisticated understanding of courage that Marcus had learned from his grandmother would have been impressive coming from an adult, but hearing it from a 6-year-old who was living proof of its truth was almost overwhelming. Khalil realized that this child possessed a form of wisdom that his wealth and education had never provided, hard-won insights about resilience and determination that came from facing impossible circumstances with nothing but inner strength and the memory of a grandmother's love. Their food arrived with the artistic presentation that Le Bernardin was famous for, but Khalil found himself watching Marcus's reaction more than focusing on his own meal. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of the perfectly prepared salmon and colorful array of vegetables, but he waited politely for Khalil to begin eating before picking up his own fork. "This is the most beautiful food I've ever seen," Marcus said with genuine awe, cutting a small piece of salmon and chewing it slowly, as though he wanted to savor every flavor and texture. "It tastes like the ocean, but in a good way. Not scary like when I was at the beach with my grandma and the water was too big." The poetic way that Marcus described his food revealed an innate sensitivity to beauty and experience that had survived despite the hardships he had endured, suggesting depths of personality and potential that were being wasted while he struggled simply to survive on the streets. Khalil began to understand that he was not just sharing a meal with a hungry child. but encountering a remarkable human being whose circumstances had prevented the world from recognizing his true value. As they ate, Marcus asked questions about Khalil's life, with the directness that children use when they are genuinely curious, rather than trying to be polite. "Are you rich like the people on TV?" he asked, looking around the restaurant with obvious appreciation for its elegance and sophistication. The question forced Khalil to confront the reality of his wealth from the perspective of someone who had nothing, and he found himself struggling to explain the concept of being rich to a child who measured wealth in terms of having enough food to eat and a safe place to sleep. "I have more money than I need," he said finally, recognizing that this simple definition was more honest than the complex explanations he usually gave about real estate markets and investment strategies. "Then why do you look so sad?" Marcus asked with the blunt perceptiveness that children often display when adults think they're being subtle about their emotions. "My grandma always said that money can't buy the things that really matter, like love and family and feeling happy inside." The observation struck Khalil with devastating accuracy, because his wealth had indeed proven useless against the grief and emptiness that had consumed him since losing his son. All the luxury and comfort that money could provide felt hollow when the person he most wanted to share it with was gone forever, and sitting across from Marcus was forcing him to confront truths about happiness and meaning that he had been avoiding for months. "You're right," Khalil admitted, surprised by his own willingness to be vulnerable with this child. "I lost someone very important to me, and having money didn't protect me from that pain or help me feel better about it." Marcus nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who had experienced profound loss despite his young age. "I miss my grandma every day too," he said. "But she told me that people we love never really leave us. They just move to a place in our hearts where we can visit them anytime we want to remember how much they loved us." The simple theology that Marcus offered was more comforting than any of the condolences Khalil had received from friends, family members, or religious leaders who had tried to make sense of his son's death. There was something about receiving wisdom from a child who was still actively grieving his own loss that made it feel authentic rather than theoretical, earned rather than recited from books or traditions. As their meal continued, Khalil found himself sharing memories of his son that he had not been able to talk about with anyone else. Stories that Marcus listened to with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "Amir loved to build things with blocks," Khalil said, smiling for the first time in months as he remembered his son's elaborate constructions. "He would spend hours creating these incredible structures, and then he would invite me to help him knock them down so we could start over with something new." "That sounds fun," Marcus said wistfully. "I never had blocks, but my grandma and I used to build forts out of couch cushions and pretend we were explorers discovering new places. She said imagination was better than any toy because it was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you." The parallel between Amir's block constructions and Marcus's cushion forts revealed the universal nature of childhood creativity and the fundamental human need to build, create, and imagine, regardless of economic circumstances. Both boys had found ways to transform simple materials into elaborate worlds of possibility, demonstrating that joy and wonder could flourish anywhere if nurtured by loving adults who understood their importance. As the evening progressed, other diners began to leave, but Khalil and Marcus remained at their table, caught up in a conversation that seemed to exist outside of normal time and social expectations. The restaurant staff, initially concerned about the unusual arrangement, began to recognize that they were witnessing something meaningful rather than disruptive, a connection between two people that transcended the boundaries that usually kept their worlds separate. "Marcus," Khalil said finally, realizing that the practical questions he had been avoiding could no longer be ignored. "What happens when you leave here tonight? Where will you sleep?" The return to immediate practical concerns brought both of them back to the reality that their shared meal existed within a larger context of homelessness, loss, and systemic problems that could not be solved with kindness alone. Marcus's face showed a flicker of the anxiety that he had been suppressing while enjoying the safety and warmth of the restaurant. "I'll find somewhere," he said, with the resigned determination of someone who had learned that adults often asked questions about problems they had no intention of actually solving. "I always do." But Khalil had reached a decision during their conversation, driven by a combination of genuine care for Marcus and recognition that this child represented an opportunity for healing that he had not expected to find. What if I told you that you didn't have to find somewhere tonight, that there might be a better solution? The hope that flickered in Marcus's eyes was tempered by the caution that comes from having been disappointed by adult promises before, but he could not entirely suppress his longing for the kind of stability and security that most children took for granted. What do you mean? I mean that I have a very large apartment with more bedrooms than I use, and I think my son would have wanted me to help another little boy who needed a safe place to stay, Khalil said, the words emerging from a place of conviction that surprised him with its clarity and strength. Would you like to come home with me, at least for tonight? The offer represented a leap of faith for both of them, requiring Marcus to trust a stranger, and requiring Khalil to open his carefully guarded private space to someone who represented both hope for connection and the risk of additional loss. But something about their conversation had created a foundation of understanding that made the impossible seem not only possible, but inevitable. Marcus's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds, illuminating his face with joy and relief that he no longer had to face the night alone on dangerous streets. Yes, please, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a prayer, finally answered. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Khalil realized that he was not just taking home a homeless child, but potentially beginning a relationship that could transform both their lives in ways that neither could fully imagine. The boy who had asked to eat with him had opened a door to healing that Khalil had thought was closed forever, proving that sometimes the most important connections come from the most unexpected encounters. The maître d' watched their departure with a mixture of curiosity and approval, recognizing that he had witnessed something remarkable even if he could not fully understand its implications. Other diners followed their exit with expressions ranging from puzzlement to admiration, unsure whether they had seen an act of charity or something deeper and more transformative. As they walked out into the Manhattan night, Marcus slipped his small hand into Khalil's larger one, with the natural trust of a child who had found the safety he had been seeking. The gesture was simple, but it carried the promise of new beginnings for both of them. The possibility that love and family could be created rather than just inherited, and that sometimes the people we need most appear in our lives disguised as strangers, asking for nothing more than the chance to share a meal. The wealthy Arab businessman and the homeless black child walked together through the city streets, two people who had been alone in their grief and need discovering that healing could come through the most unexpected connections, proving that family is not always determined by blood or culture, but sometimes by the simple human choice to care for someone who needs caring, to love someone who needs loving, and to build something new from the ruins of what has been lost.